The files dropped not like rain, but like concrete. A digital tomb unsealed by the American Department of Justice, burying a royal name under millions of pages of sordid data. The internet did not break. It merely buckled under the weight of the revelations. News tickers turned into frantic, repeating loops of three names: Epstein, Maxwell, Pause, Andrew. The anatomy of a fall, broadcast in real time. In the digital sludge, one image surfaced and refused to sync. An undated photograph of a man resembling the prince on his knees over a woman in Epstein's New York mansion. It wasn't proof of a crime, it was worse. It was a portrait of allegiance. The public reaction was not shock. It was a cold, grim confirmation of a story they had already written in their minds. Epstein's ghost now had a permanent residence in Windsor. The verdict from the House of Windsor was delivered without sentiment. It was a business decision, a brutal piece of corporate restructuring. The statement from Buckingham Palace was a masterpiece of institutional ice. It spoke of titles and duties, but its true message was one of amputation. To save the body, the gangrenous limb had to go. The king, his brother, chose the crown. A choice made decades ago, simply ratified now with ink on paper. This was Andrew's fatal error, laid bare. He believed his blood was a shield. He discovered it was merely a line item on a balance sheet of risk. His banishment from Royal Lodge, the home that smelled of his privilege, was the final clause in the contract of his disgrace. Pause. The eviction notice was signed Charles R. Brother's signature, sealing a fate more complete than any court could deliver. This wasn't a punishment. It was an erasure. And so, the archive seals the file on the prince and opens the dossier on the man. Before the rot set in, there was brilliance, or something that looked like it. He was the second son, born into the gilded cage, but without the burden of the key. This gave him a different kind of currency. A reckless charm. He was the spare, but for a time, he was the star. The Falklands War minted him a hero. He returned from the South Atlantic not just as a prince, but as a warrior, the salt of the sea still on his skin. The nation saw a dashing pilot, a man of action, not just ceremony. His nickname, Randy Andy, was then a mark of roguish charisma, not a stain of depravity. It was the 80s. Greed was good, and a handsome prince with a war record and a wandering eye was a national asset. Pause. He was the crown's most bankable human stock, a walking, talking piece of public relations gold. He mistook this temporary market value for inherent, eternal worth. That was the first in a long inventory of errors. The infection vector has a name. It appears in the ledgers of Andrew's life not as a threat, but as an asset, a connection. Jeffrey Epstein. The name was a key to a world the prince craved, a world beyond ribbon cuttings and polite applause. This was the dark, pulsating heart of global finance and influence. Epstein wasn't a person. He was a private, unregulated stock market of power. And Andrew, feeling his own royal currency devalue with age, wanted a controlling share. The introduction was made, as these things often are, through a woman. Pause. Ghislaine Maxwell, daughter of a fallen tycoon, a social navigator with a compass that always pointed toward money and secrecy. She provided the bridge. Andrew saw a network of billionaires, scientists, and politicians. He saw opportunity. He did not see the architecture of the trap being built around him. The early warning signs were not overlooked. They were reclassified. The whispers were dismissed as the jealous gossip of the excluded. The strangeness of the private island was reframed as eccentricity, the price of genius. This is the anatomy of the fall. It begins not with a leap, but with a single confident step onto what looks like solid ground, only to find it is the lid of a coffin. The first tremors were not a seismic shock, but the subtle vibration of a distant collapse. Legal filings began to appear in American court dockets. Quietly at first. The name Pause, Virginia, Giuffre surfaced not as a headline, but as a footnote in the sprawling indictment of Pause Jeffrey Epstein. The palace's response was textbook, a denial wrapped in protocol, cold and precise. It was a strategy built on centuries of institutional arrogance, the belief that the walls of the firm were impermeable to the noise of the common world. But this wasn't noise. It was evidence. The first piece was a photograph. Grainy, poorly lit, but unmistakable. Pause, Andrew, arm draped around the waist of a 17-year-old girl. Pause, Ghislaine Maxwell, grinning in the background like a proud auctioneer. The official line was that it was a fake, a digital ghost. But the image refused to be exorcised. It became a stain on the public consciousness, a single indelible data point in the coming posthumous audit of his life. He believed the system that had always protected him was infallible. That was his first critical miscalculation. The second was about to be broadcast to the world. The fatal error was an act of hubris so pure it was almost beautiful, an attempt to control the narrative by stepping directly into the heart of the storm. He agreed to an interview. Pause. The BBC Newsnight special. It was meant to be an act of self-exoneration. It became his public epitaph. He sat in that chair not as a prince, but as a specimen under a microscope. Every word was a new incision. He spoke of a pizza express in Woking. He claimed a medical inability to sweat, a bizarre and specific detail meant to dismantle an accuser's story. But it did the opposite. It sounded like the desperate invention of a man cornered by a truth he could not name. This was the anatomy of the fall, televised for millions. The interview took the abstract allegations, the flight logs, the whispers, and gave them a face. His face. The face of a man who seemed more concerned with the logistics of his alibi than the gravity of the accusations. The emails that surfaced later were merely supporting documents for a verdict already rendered by the public. The door to his old life didn't just close, it was welded shut from the inside. And on the other side of that welded door was a ghost. The ghost of Pause, Virginia, Giuffre. Her story was the corrosive agent that ate through the royal plating, exposing the base metal beneath. It was never just an accusation. It was a detailed, humiliating cartography of power abused, a map drawn on a young girl's memory, leading from a London nightclub to a Belgravia townhouse, to a bath. The civil suit was not a legal proceeding. It was a siege. Her lawyers were not just advocates. They were demolition experts dismantling his reputation one deposition at a time. The final settlement, the multi-million-pound payment, was meant to purchase silence. Instead, it became the price tag on his guilt. He didn't buy her silence. He bought a receipt for the damage he had caused. Pause. A receipt that would be entered into the permanent, unforgiving ledger of history. Her posthumously published memoirs were not a final word. They were an eternal echo. The ghost had a name, but the network that summoned it was a creature of shadow and influence. This was his fatal error. Not the act itself, but the company he kept. Pause. Jeffrey Epstein did not offer friendship. He offered a key to a world built on the foundations of transactional depravity, where money and status provided a temporary insulation from consequence. The flight logs for the Lolita Express were not just travel itineraries. They were a digital coffin, burying the reputations of all who were listed. Pause. Andrew's entanglement was not a simple mistake. It was a covenant, a willing entry into a club where the membership fee was your own soul. The released archives, the emails, the infamous photographs, they were not revelations. They were merely the minutes from meetings he always claimed he never attended. The shadow of Epstein's bunker, his island, his network, became Andrew's own. It was a debt inherited not by blood, but by choice. And the interest was compounding daily, payable in public humiliation. The public humiliation was merely the down payment. The real sentence was the silence that followed. The exile to Sandringham wasn't a retreat. It was an internment. Royal Lodge, his sprawling monument to self-importance, now stood empty, a cold museum of a life that was. He traded 30 rooms for a gilded cage, a respectable address that smelled of fresh paint and quiet surveillance. This was the anatomy of his fall, a slow grinding process of erasure. The titles were not just removed, they were amputated, leaving phantom pains of a status he could no longer claim. He was now just a name, a historical footnote in his own family's ledger. The reported penury was not about a lack of bread. It was the loss of the checkbook as a weapon and a shield. His fortune, once a source of independence, became his allowance, his leash. Pause. The true inventory of his sins was tallied in the faces of staff who refused to serve him, in the phone calls that were never made, in the deafening quiet of a life disconnected from the grid of influence he once commanded. This was the mutilation of his destiny. Not a sudden death, but a long, drawn-out fade into irrelevance, haunted by the ghosts of what he had thrown away. This case file is more than the biography of one man. It is a posthumous audit of an era's arrogance. His legacy is not a foundation or a portrait in a hall. It is a permanent stain on the velvet curtain of the monarchy, a structural weakness revealed. He was the living embodiment of the rot that can fester in the space between immense privilege and zero accountability. The shine and the squalor inextricably linked. His story becomes a bitter testament, a warning about the associations we keep and the company we crave. The allure of a world without rules is a siren's call, and the rocks are littered with the wreckage of powerful men. Pause. The final verdict's not written in a courtroom, but in the annals of the House of Windsor. His was not a tragedy of fate. It was a long series of choices, each one a nail in his own digital coffin. The ultimate lesson, etched into the obituaries of his public life, is a simple and brutal one. There are some debts that even a prince cannot pay, and there are some stains that even a crown cannot hide. The empire of his name is now just rubble and silence.